The city was still half asleep when Ethan stepped off the early bus, a thin mist curling around the streets like breath held too long. He carried his portfolio close to his chest, a folder filled not with dreams of wealth or ambition, but ultrasound images that would never be his. The hospital's fertility clinic loomed ahead, glass and steel shining like a promise he could never reach. He hesitated at the entrance, the reflection in the door catching a man he barely recognized, tired eyes, and shaven jaw, a suit too big for the body that had grown smaller since his wife left. He had thought love would be enough. He had thought holding her every night, whispering that they'd find a way, would keep her from breaking. But love had limits, and so did patience. She had wanted a baby, the kind of simple, pure thing people take for granted. He wanted it too, maybe even more, but his body had betrayed him long before his heart did. Inside the clinic, the smell of antiseptic was sharp, cutting through the fog in his head. The receptionist smiled politely, her name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Ethan Moore," she asked. He nodded. "Dr. Patel will see you shortly. Please take a seat." He sat near the window, staring at a young couple across the room. She was glowing, clutching her husband's hand as they whispered about baby names. Ethan turned away before the ache in his chest could bloom into tears. He thought of the empty nursery at home, the soft yellow walls, the crib they'd assembled before the diagnosis, the tiny socks still in their packaging. The room had become a tomb for a future that never came. "Mr. Moore." Dr. Patel's voice was kind, but Ethan had learned that kindness often preceded bad news. He followed the doctor into a small office filled with diplomas and family photos, smiling children, proud parents. The irony didn't escape him. "We've reviewed your tests again, Drive," Patel said, sliding a folder across the desk. "I'm afraid there's been no improvement. Your condition is permanent. I'm truly sorry." The words were clinical, final, as though his dream had a medical code attached to it. Ethan forced a smile, nodding as if it didn't matter, as if the ground hadn't just shifted beneath his feet. "Thank you for trying," he said softly. He left the clinic without remembering how he got to the street. The morning had brightened, but it felt cruel, the sun too sharp, the world too alive. He walked until his legs ached, until the city noise faded into a low hum. When his phone buzzed, he almost didn't answer, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar. "Mr. Moore, this is the Vale Foundation. You applied for our genetic research program last month." He stopped walking. He had almost forgotten about that desperate late-night application, a medical trial that claimed to be working on next-generation fertility solutions. It had sounded like science fiction, but he had filled out every form anyway. "Yes," he said, his voice uncertain. "You've been shortlisted for a private interview," the woman said. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m., at the Vale Research Center. Please bring valid identification." The line clicked off before he could ask anything else. Ethan stood there on the sidewalk, surrounded by strangers rushing to jobs and lives that made sense. The Vale Foundation. He knew the name. Everyone did. It belonged to Alexander Vale, the billionaire who had built an empire on technology, medicine, and ruthlessness. A man who had everything Ethan didn't: power, wealth, family. Ethan looked down at his trembling hands. Maybe it was foolish, maybe even dangerous, but for the first time in years, the word hope didn't feel like a curse. He turned toward home, clutching the phone like a lifeline. He didn't know what the interview would bring, or why someone like Alexander Vale would care about a broken man like him. All he knew was that something had shifted, a spark in the darkness, small and fragile, but enough to make him take another step forward. For the first time since his wife had left, Ethan felt like the story wasn't over yet. Ethan arrived at the Vale Research Center early the next morning, though the term, center, felt too modest for what loomed before him. The building stretched into the fog like a monument, all glass, steel, and silence. It didn't feel like a place for healing or science, it felt like power disguised as progress. 2 security guards greeted him at the gates, polite but impersonal, scanning his ID and checking his name against a tablet before ushering him through a marble-lined lobby that could have belonged to a palace. A woman in a tailored navy suit approached him. Her heels clicked on the polished floor with precision, each step rehearsed. "Mr. Moore," she said with a professional smile. "I'm Amelia Crane, Director of Research Communications. Mr. Vale will see you personally. Ethan froze. Mr. Vale. The Alexander Vale. Amelia's smile didn't waver. He takes special interest in certain candidates. You're one of them. The elevator ride felt endless. Ethan caught his reflection in the mirrored walls, nervous, underdressed, out of place. Amelia stood perfectly still beside him, her eyes fixed ahead. When the doors opened, they revealed a wide corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. At the far end, through an open glass door, a figure stood with his back turned, framed by sunlight. Alexander Vale didn't need an introduction. Even in silhouette, he radiated authority. Tall, composed, wearing a charcoal suit that fit like armor. He turned as they entered, and Ethan found himself face to face with the man whose name had built an empire, and broken more than a few along the way. Mr. Moore, Vale said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. Thank you for coming. Thank you for considering me, Ethan replied, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. Amelia left the room silently, closing the door behind her. Vale gestured toward a leather chair opposite his desk. Sit. Ethan obeyed. The office was massive but minimalist. No clutter, no warmth. Only a single photograph sat on the desk, a woman with soft eyes and a distant smile. I've read your file, Vale said, steepling his fingers. You've been through quite a journey. Multiple failed treatments, financial strain, and still, you haven't given up. Ethan swallowed. I just want to be a father. That's all I've ever wanted. Vale studied him for a long moment, eyes sharp and unreadable. I understand that desire more than you might think, he said quietly. But tell me, Mr. Moore, how far would you go to make it happen? The question hung between them like a blade. Ethan shifted in his seat, unsure whether it was rhetorical. I'd do anything that doesn't hurt someone, he said. Vale's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. A noble boundary. Let's hope it stays that way. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the skyline. My wife, Clara, cannot have children. We've tried everything. Doctors, treatments, even surrogacy, all failed. You and I, Mr. Moore, are bound by the same tragedy, though for opposite reasons. Ethan's heart pounded. Then why am I here? Vale turned, his expression unreadable. Because I've invested in a new genetic project. Radical, untested, but promising. We call it the Legacy Initiative, the merging of viable genetic material to create possibility. Ethan frowned. You mean cloning? Vale shook his head. No, something more human, something that bridges what science calls impossible. You, Mr. Moore, would be the first candidate. Ethan felt the air thicken. Why me? Because you have the one thing money can't buy. Desperation with purpose, Vale said. His gaze was almost gentle, but the words carried the chill of calculation. You would protect what's created, no matter the cost. A silence followed, heavy and intimate. Vale stepped closer, lowering his voice. If this works, you won't just become a father, Ethan. You'll become the reason a new generation exists. Ethan's throat was dry. The offer sounded insane. Impossible, yet his heart hammered with hope. He thought of the empty nursery, of the quiet nights filled with what-ifs. What would I have to do? Vale smiled faintly. You'll meet with our medical team tomorrow. There are personal elements to discuss. My wife will need to be involved. Ethan blinked, uncertain if he'd heard correctly. Your wife? Vale nodded slowly. She doesn't know yet, but she will. The room seemed to tilt. Ethan wanted to speak, to question, but his voice failed him. Vale extended a hand, steady, commanding. Think of it this way, Mr. Moore, he said. 2 broken dreams, 1 perfect solution. Ethan hesitated, then took his hand. The billionaire's grip was warm, firm, and in that moment, Ethan couldn't tell if he had just been saved, or sold. The news broke like a storm that wouldn't pass. One moment, Ethan was holding the sonogram of a tiny heartbeat, his heartbeat, the proof that his dream had finally taken form. The next, his name was flashing across screens, whispered in scandalous tones by anchors and strangers alike. Billionaire Alexander Vale implicated in genetic infidelity scandal. The words were impossible to ignore. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. The project had been secret, hidden behind clinical reports, encrypted data, and contracts written in the kind of language meant to bury the truth. Ethan had trusted Vale's assurances. No one would ever know. But secrets had a way of finding air. Someone inside the Vale Foundation had leaked the files, and within days, the world knew everything, that Vale's wife, Clara, had carried a child that wasn't entirely her husband's, that the genetic candidate was a man with nothing to lose. A man named Ethan Moore. He hadn't left his apartment in days. Reporters camped outside his building. His phone buzzed endlessly, calls from journalists, doctors, even lawyers promising to help him sue for millions. But Ethan didn't want money. He wanted peace. He wanted to hold the child without the world calling him a monster. A knock rattled the door. He ignored it, but it came again, harder this time. "Ethan, it's me." Clara's voice. He opened the door to find her standing there in a long gray coat, her face half hidden behind sunglasses. Her hair was unkempt, her lips pale. She looked nothing like the poised woman from the photographs in Vale's office. Without a word, she stepped inside. "They're everywhere," she said quietly. "Outside my house. My husband's being torn apart in the press. Investors are leaving. He won't even speak to me." Ethan couldn't meet her eyes. "You didn't have to come here." "I did." She removed her glasses, revealing red-rimmed eyes. "Because I needed to see you before all of this gets worse." He nodded, unsure what to say. The air between them was heavy, a silence that carried everything they hadn't dared speak during the project. The unspoken closeness, the long hours of whispered fears, the warmth that had slipped in between clinical procedures and contracts. "They're saying I betrayed him," she said, her voice trembling. "That I cheated, but I didn't. Not in the way they mean. I just wanted a child. I thought I could live without love, but not without that." Ethan stepped closer, his chest tightening. "You don't owe them an explanation. You were trying to build something good out of what he destroyed." Clara looked up at him, eyes shining. "And what about you, Ethan? What were you trying to build?" He hesitated. "A reason to keep living." For a moment, neither of them moved. The city's noise bled faintly through the window, sirens, camera clicks, distant voices. Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a photograph. It was grainy but unmistakable, the tiny profile of the child growing inside her. "She's almost 8 months, she said softly. "Healthy, strong." Ethan's eyes stung. Clara nodded, smiling weakly. "A little girl, she kicks when she hears music." He tried to smile, but the weight of it all pressed down too hard. "She'll hate me one day," he whispered. "The world will tell her I'm the reason her family broke apart." "No," Clara said firmly. "She'll know you gave her life. That's more than most fathers ever do." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. "Alexander will fight for her. For custody. He'll say she's his because he can't bear to lose control of anything, not even love." Ethan clenched his fists. "He can have everything else. Not her." The words startled them both, loud and final in the quiet room. Clara looked at him. Really looked at him, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. Just two people wrecked by choices they couldn't undo, bound by a life they'd created together. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his cheek. "You can't fight him the way he fights, Ethan. He destroys. You build. That's your strength." He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. For a heartbeat, the world disappeared, the headlines, the shame, the chaos. There was only her warmth and the fragile promise of the child they both loved in their own broken ways. When he opened his eyes again, she was already walking toward the door. "Clara," she paused, hand on the doorknob. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "One day, when the noise fades, maybe she'll find you. Maybe then you can both start over." And just like that, she was gone. Ethan stood there, the photo trembling in his hands, the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. The world outside still screamed his name, but for the first time, he didn't care. Somewhere out there was a little girl, his daughter, proof that even from ruin, something pure could be born. The years softened the noise, as time always does. Scandal faded into gossip, gossip into rumor, and then into silence. By the time the headlines stopped mentioning his name, Ethan had long since left the city behind. He moved to a small coastal town where no one cared who he was, just another man who repaired boats, drank black coffee, and kept to himself. The world had called him a fraud, a thief, a monster. But the truth was quieter than that, and far sadder. Every evening, after closing his workshop, he would walk down to the shore and watch the tide pull itself back and forth, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The sea was his penance and his peace. Sometimes, he would think of Clara, the way she'd looked that last day, standing in his doorway, her voice trembling between love and guilt. Other times, he thought of the child, the daughter he had never met. He didn't even know her name. Until the letter arrived. It came on a gray morning, years after he'd stopped expecting anything. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting neat and familiar. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. "Ethan, I don't know if you still think of us. I don't know if you'll forgive me for the silence. Alexander is gone. The world says it was an accident, but I think it was something else. A heart that finally broke under the weight of everything he tried to control. She's 12 now. Her name is Lila. She's asking questions I can't answer. She deserves to know where she comes from. We'll be in town next week. If you're ready, come to the garden behind the lighthouse at sunset. Clara." Ethan read the letter 3 times before he could breathe again. His hands trembled as he set it down. Lila. The name felt like a prayer he had been whispering for years without realizing it. He had imagined this moment in 1,000 different ways, sometimes with joy, sometimes with fear, but now that it was real, he felt only a quiet ache. The days that followed passed in a blur. He barely slept. When the evening came, he walked to the lighthouse, his heart beating like it was remembering how to live. The sky burned with the colors of dusk, gold bleeding into rose, rose into indigo. The garden was small, overgrown with wildflowers, the scent of salt and grass thick in the air. He saw them before they saw him. Clara sat on a bench, her hair streaked with silver now, her posture softer, calmer. Beside her stood a girl with dark curls and eyes so impossibly familiar they stopped his breath. Lila. Clara looked up first. Their eyes met across the garden, and for a moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled. Tired, but real. "You came," she said. "I wasn't sure I could," Ethan replied quietly. Lila turned to him, curious. "Mom," she asked, "is this him?" Clara nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, this is Ethan." The girl stepped closer, studying his face. "You look nervous," she said. He laughed softly, the sound catching in his throat. "I am. I've waited a long time to meet you." Lila tilted her head, a shy smile playing on her lips. "Mom says you're the reason I exist." Ethan swallowed hard. "I don't know if that's true," he said gently. "But I've always hoped I'd get to tell you how much you were wanted." Clara stood, joining them. "She knows what happened," she said quietly. "Not all of it, but enough. I didn't want her growing up with lies." Lila slipped her small hand into Ethan's. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting all this time. "Do you want to walk with us?" she asked. Ethan nodded, unable to speak. The 3 of them walked slowly along the garden path, the waves whispering below. Clara spoke of the years they'd lost, of Alexander's decline, of the freedom that came too late. Lila talked about her drawings, her music lessons, her dream of becoming a doctor. Ethan listened, memorizing every sound, every word. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila ran ahead, chasing the light. Clara lingered beside him. "I told her you were a good man," she said softly. "Flawed, but good." She deserved to know that her story didn't come from shame. Ethan looked at her, emotion thick in his voice. "And you, do you forgive me?" She smiled faintly. "I stopped blaming you the day I realized we were both trying to create life in a world that kept taking it away." They stood there in the fading light, 2 ghosts finally finding peace in the shape of a child running through wildflowers. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like the story's villain. He watched Lila laugh, her hair catching the wind, and whispered to himself, "She's perfect." And for the first time, he truly believed that something beautiful had survived the wreckage.